So I thought I'd just chat for a while on some stuff loosely themed around, I guess, shared space, shared pedestrian cycling infrastructure, the conflicts that generates, a few things that have come up on social media recently around that, why they happen, why they get designed. And I keep getting these ideas for something that could work in video and then never actually making them because I don't have the time to make something that matches up to the idea that I have in my head for how the finished thing will look. But then I saw the other day Alexei Sayl's lockdown bike rides, and his wonderful format of just going out for a ride and mumbling incoherently at the camera for a while about nothing in particular. So I figured I could just chat about these issues while I go for my exercise and head to the shop. We have a railway path cat. And it's not really about the kind of shared use that we're on here. This is our wonderful arterial railway path into town, although this does demonstrate very nicely some of the conflicts that it generates. It's a regular topic in the local next door groups and so on. The problems with cycling and walking, sharing space on a very narrow path. And it also illustrates some of the history of why we've ended up with this stuff. But really it's more about kind of Bristol speciality of disguising cycle routes and the problems that causes. You can see with our wonderful railway path, we've got the zebra crossing that went in about a decade ago to help manage some of the conflict between cycling and walking along here. We're very much in the inner suburbs here, very dense residential area, lots of people using this path. You can also see in places where trees have been cut back recently ahead of planned works to widen the path in places, and in some places to segregate cycling from walking. And perhaps that brings us to the first thing on this theme of how did we end up with this stuff. Is that for a very long time that has been resisted on this path. The problems along here have been going for, well, I was writing about this a decade ago, but it's been going on a lot longer than that. But people didn't want to put separate space for walking and cycling. And that, I think, came out of a slight misunderstanding of how to actually design the cycling and walking, which has given us some bad infrastructure for quite a long time. It's tempting to think that the reason we have all of this shared space is simply because it's cheap. People didn't want to put the money into doing it properly, and you'd be right about that. Here's another spot where they've started clearing the trees to remodel this junction. Certainly the origins of shared use are in part down to, in I think the early 80s, having a cheap way to just convert existing footways, pavements, into something you can cycle on. So it was in part about saving the money of doing it properly. You could literally just stick up a sign and say that you've made a cycleway without doing any actual construction. But it's also proliferated in recent years in large part because people have been saying that it's actually better to share the space. And that comes out in part from experience with paths, including this one. This one used to have a white line all of the way down the middle, separating cycling on one side and walking on the other side. And obviously that didn't work very well on a path that is this wide. You ended up with 1.5 meters for each mode. You can't even get oncoming cycling passing in that amount of space. And about 20 years ago they finally gave up on that, realizing that it really hadn't worked. It was creating more conflict than it was solving. And that was fine. It was the wrong thing to do on a 3 meter wide path. However, out of that, they started sharing that lesson and saying that segregating walking from cycling doesn't work. We tried it on things like the railway path. It created more conflict. Don't separate cycling from walking. Rather than learning, don't build a 3 meter wide shared path in a dense, inner urban residential area where it will be used by too many people and will be oversubscribed. Rather than learning that you should do almost what you've got here and have a separate footway along the side, although even here it's still too narrow. Rather than learning that lesson, they learned just don't bother separating cycling from walking at all, and they started spreading that message. It got into various bits of official technical design guidance, and organisations like Sustrans delivering this stuff went around telling their clients it's better not to separate cycling from walking. And so we ended up with this stuff proliferating over the past few years. And you can actually see how this misunderstanding propagates over time and how it spreads and mutates, how it developed from, if you have 3 meters of space, it's probably best not to segregate it, to you shouldn't try segregating at all. You can trace that to its absurdist conclusion, which is what the Royal Parks did a few years ago in Hyde Park, where they had the Broad Walk, which is a very wide path down the eastern side of Hyde Park. It comes out at Hyde Park Corner through a big old arch gate, and that always used to have dedicated space marked out for cycling on it. It was marked quite badly, but it was there, it was dedicated space. And a couple of years ago they had heard that segregating walking from cycling was actually not the right thing to do, and so they rolled that back and mixed walking and cycling, and that led to very predictable problems. I feel really bad for the pedestrians, especially the tourists who turn up at this supposed great tourist destination to be confronted with this. We're coming up now to a different kind of shared use, part of the group of really a variety of different things that fall under this umbrella. And this one is the Fiddly Facility. It's a bit of a Bristol special in that it's not even signed properly, so you don't really know where you're going, what you're supposed to be doing here. It's only if you've used it several times before, or if you remember years back when they were putting this in and calling it a cycle route. But you would know how you're supposed to use this. So we've got a couple of Toucan Crossings here on this little gyratory system, which will lead us to some nice quiet streets. And it is one of those fiddly facilities that you actually see people getting wrong because it's so confusing and badly designed with no proper signage. So I've seen people riding the wrong way down this contraflow lane here before. But that is very much the not putting the effort into shift curbs, find space, take away parking and motoring lanes to find space to design the proper route through there. Is you just put in a fiddly bit of shared use. However, we do have a nice example along here of opposing one-ways, creating a low traffic area. You can drive into each of these streets, but they just take you around a one-way system straight back up onto the main road you came from. Takes us to what was another fiddly thing, but it's just in the past couple of weeks been replaced with quite a smart little proper protected track. I'm not sure this would have been my priority for making the upgrade. The upgrade is welcome anyway, but we do have a bit of a habit of focusing on the routes that we already have, and every few years some money becomes available and we upgrade the routes that we already have instead of getting on with building some new ones. But there we go. It takes us up to a nice example of the alternative to all the shared use. A nice proper dedicated track along, this is now the inner ring road. So this was put in a couple of years ago. It's got nice details, bus stop bypasses, it's got these forgiving curbs that won't throw you off if you accidentally ride up to them. Plenty of pedestrian crossings. I'm not sure the tactiles are entirely correct. It all goes a bit wrong at the end here, where we end up on another fiddly bit of shared use. But that takes us up to the first of these facilities in question. So one that came up the other day when somebody on Twitter, another Joe on Twitter, has posted that they had reported a clip that they got from this path a bit further down, where a motorist had driven across the shared use path that this leads up to. So this separated path gives up on the other side of the ring road here. The ring road runs in a cutting underneath this junction. And it gives up and just becomes shared use on the other side because of the construction work for this new tall building on the other side. So they'd reported this motorist driving on the shared use path, and the police had come back and said, well, actually we could fine you for cycling on the footway here, when they were fairly obviously on a shared use path. In fairness, the signage is all wrong down here, so it's missing the shared use path signage. However, that's not really much of a defence, considering it's fairly obviously a shared use path here. It leads up to a Toucan Crossing. There are bits of signage in place, just not all of the signage it technically should have. So it was a fairly inappropriate response of the police to come back with that. Even worse was that when everybody then dunked on them, pointing out that it's fairly obviously a shared use path up there, was that they then came back and said, well, okay Len, we won't fine you, but you better not go cycling on footways, which was extra especially compounding the inappropriateness of the original response. rather than a grovelling apology they should have come out with for making the inappropriate threats in the first place, to come back and grudgingly say, okay, we won't fine you for something that you didn't do wrong, that is not remotely against any rules. So I think technically the footway on the other side is shared use here, but it's bad enough at the best of times even without all of this work going on. Does lead us up to what is the type specimen of what is technically known in all of the design guidance as segregated shared use, even though that's oxymoron. We have separate footway and separate cycleway. Not shared use at all, but it's you may know it from the cover of, I think it was Local Transport Note 112, the design guidance for shared use infrastructure, which is one of the ones that perpetuated this misunderstanding that separating the modes is actually a bad thing, despite the fact that they had this fairly good, well-established example of how to design it properly. Beat up to Bristol Bridge, where the new bus gate is filtering the traffic through the centre of town. It's a new system that keeps all of the traffic on the inner ring road and provides these 3 different cells, low traffic cells through the centre. Maybe I should do a bit of a video introducing that someday, explaining how that works properly, because the council have done a particularly bad job of actually communicating the point of the bus gate and how, by getting the traffic out of the centre, it speeds up all of the bus routes. Anyway, not one for this video. I'm just going, this is not the sensible route to where I was going next, but I'm just taking this detour so I can show you a few other things along the way on this theme of shared use. It will take us up here to, we've come back round to the other side of the inner ring road here now, coming up at this roundabout, but also to another one of the city's flagship cycle routes, which uses a lot of this shared use along the way, including this zebra. It does take us up to, along the way, a proper segregated path, except that they're doing refurbishment works on the lifting bridge, so at the moment that's for the people walking in it as well. De facto shared use. It leads us up along, again, this used to be part of the main inner ring road, which used to cut right through here. These buildings on the corner are recent replacements for ones that had been demolished to allow the inner ring road to go through here, and then that came through in a dual carriageway through this corner, cut across this square. that's another story, but it leaves us with, again, another one of these routes with the segregated shared use, so-called segregated shared use, walking on one side, cycling on the other. But this is, we're now getting into the Bristol speciality that I wanted to show you, which is the disguised infrastructure. So it does have the shared use signs alongside, but it also has these very subtle stones embedded in it, which is something that the city has used on a few routes and which frequently leads to lots of confusion, people not realising that the path is there, people walking on the wrong side, riding on the wrong side, creating conflict, people walking across the cycling side of the lights here. Here's yet another one of these collection of all of the different types of bad shared use. So we've got the footbridge that was put in 20 years ago, which was never wide enough in the first place, but especially so now that lots of the redevelopment has progressed and there's now loads more people living in this area, visiting this area. So the bridge is always oversubscribed and congested, generating discomfort. Leading us into some examples of the shared use that it's all over the old harbour side, the former docks, the disused industrial areas. So a lot of the redevelopment has progressed along here, but there are a few undeveloped areas still, which brings us to yet another of these many types of shared use things. Do I want to go this way? What's all this down here? So filming going on down here, which perhaps illustrates the point that I was going to make, which is that we've got all of these post-industrial sites along the harbour, and 30 years ago they were all completely derelict and they became de facto shared use. You could get into there, and I think something the city probably has never properly recognised and acknowledged is the role that these played in preventing walking and cycling dying out even more than they did during that time. Is that we were fortunate to have all of these traffic-free routes around the harbour that link together then those arterial routes in the centre. Has never been properly recognised because it was just there from after the decline of industry in the docks. It wasn't put in specifically as active travel infrastructure, so it's never been studied and recognised as active travel infrastructure. Nobody's quite acknowledged how important it is to tying together people's journeys in the city centre. And so as redevelopment has progressed, they haven't always done quite as good a job as they could have keeping these routes open and keeping them attractive and of sufficient capacity, so they get very busy at times, especially in summer. Some of the bits up ahead, it gets a bit narrow and you can't get through there. Heading back round through into town now. Let's think about how we can wrap this up, make some sort of coherent point out of this. I don't know why there's so much traffic down here today. This is supposed to be it is a through route, but it's not supposed to be a particularly attractive route. There are better routes for motorists to take. Oh, if it's full time, that will be a problem. Let's head back through town. We'll follow some more of these local speciality disguised routes. Lots more subtle symbols on paving stones. And it leads us back around actually to the other one that came up recently, which is a bit of shared use that is the main start of another one of these arterial routes. Somebody in fact parked right across the drop curb for the cycle routes there. Excellent. Yes, another one of the subtle disguised Bristol speciality routes that people don't realise is a cycleway and go walking it. Yes, so this will take us round to the start of the Greenway route, which for the past few weeks has been blocked off with barriers while there's some construction work going on. And it's where I have to kind of explain how it's supposed to work, because it is so poorly designed that it's not at all obvious what the issue is there, and that there's even a cycle route in there unless you've seen the maps and know how it's supposed to work. Which is that there's a set of drop curbs for you to get off the carriageway, or indeed return to the carriageway if you're coming the other way from the shared use area. It's also right next to a pedestrian crossing, and the pedestrian crossing has been closed due to construction works because the opposite footway is closed. And the problem is that the construction team have also closed off the separate drop curb for cycle, which is just a drop curb for re-entering the carriageway. And so the only way I can make sense of that is that the team have just totally failed to even recognise that it is a cycleway there. The cycleway is so badly designed that people don't recognise that that is what it is. So that's the last thing we'll see in this. Along the way, going along yet another one of the city speciality disguised routes, people walking along it, even though, as well as the subtle paving blocks in here, there's now extra painted cycle symbols to reinforce that this is the cycleway. It's a bit fiddly in that we've got to cross over to the other side. In fact, it's worth mentioning that this particular camouflaged route was only put in the past few years, 2 or 3 years I think, even after the one we've just come along through College Green, which has been established for about 25 years, and the one through Queen Square, which has been, I think, established for a similar amount of time. we've got at least 2 decades of experience with those and the problems that they create, the conflicts that they generate and exacerbate, and yet we're still building these disguised routes just in the past few years. No lessons learned from them. One of the issues that tends to come up in these discussions of shared use, mixing bikes and people walking, is people with special accessibility needs, so people who are perhaps reliant on a guide dog, and the guide dog needs a standardised, legible street design because they understand curbs and things like this. So when you start coming up with ad hoc and confusing and vague designs, then guide dogs have problems using them. Or it can be people who are partially sighted, perhaps they can see clear distinctions in blocks of colour and light but can't see the fine detail of these very subtle paving slabs, so it's not at all clear when you're walking in a cycleway. And while it's very important that we think about all of the different needs of different people, and we don't think about need cyclists often enough, I would actually say that in this case that's almost less important to think about, because these layouts don't work for anybody, let alone people with particular accessibility needs. They don't work for the average walker or the average cyclist. So they fail at a much more fundamental level than that anyway. So I just popped into Tesco there, and they perhaps provide the perfect story to round this off, which is that they've got a set of old-fashioned checkouts on the left where you can go and see a person and pay a person for your shopping, and they've got the self checkout machines on the right. They've got a pair of queues that lead up to them. If you're queuing for the self checkouts, which are on the right, you use the left hand queue. If you're queuing for the old-fashioned checkouts, which are on the left, you use the right hand queue. And they've put up lots of signs to explain which queue you should be in. And they've put up more signs and bigger signs, so signs on the ceiling, signs on the floor, signs on little rope fences that have been put up to separate the queues. And they've employed a person to stand at the end of the queues and check whether you're in the correct queue. And that seems to be the perfect story to sum up this little shared use infrastructure safari, which is, if you have to explain how to use your facility, then you've designed it wrong. And if the police don't realise that your infrastructure is shared use, then you've designed it wrong. And if the professionals who manage construction works don't understand that something is a cycle facility, then you've designed it wrong. These designs should be self-explanatory. People shouldn't make these mistakes. You shouldn't need to explain how it works. Here it is then, the start of the Greenway. Currently blocked off because somebody didn't realise that there's a cycleway here. That's it. I hope it wasn't too much of a rambling, incoherent mess. I hope there was a useful, interesting story in there for you somewhere. If you enjoyed that, if you like this format, it's worth doing, it's not too horrible to watch and listen to, let me know. I might make some more.